August 28, 2016. At precisely 4 p.m., the doors of the final BHS shop in Wood Green, London, were locked from the inside for the very last time. An 88-year-old British high street institution had vanished, leaving 11,000 staff without a livelihood. What exactly did Britain lose? For decades, British Home Stores was the beating heart of the town centre. With 164 massive department stores, it was the definitive destination for weekend shopping. It was where families bought school uniforms, selected their home's lighting, and shared Saturday lunches in bustling in-store cafes. The BHS carrier bag was a fixture of the British high street. Yet, seemingly overnight, those familiar, vast shop floors lay derelict. Bright window displays gave way to faded to-let boards. Bustling shopping centres were suddenly left with gaping, dark voids, while the loyal staff who built the empire were handed redundancy notices. How does a beloved national treasure collapse into administration, culminating in one of the most scandalous retail disasters in modern British history? It wasn't simply a casualty of the digital age or the rise of e-commerce. The death of BHS was engineered in boardrooms, sealed by a catastrophic lack of investment, a devastating pension deficit, and a notorious sale for a single, solitary £1 coin. The clatter of trams, the hiss of steam, and the relentless hum of foot traffic filled the air in Brixton, South London, in the spring of 1928. Britain was navigating an era of profound social change, caught between the devastating memory of the First World War and the looming shadow of the Great Depression. Yet, on a bustling stretch of pavement, a new retail experiment was bravely opening its doors to the public. It was called British Home Stores. Curiously, this uniquely British-sounding enterprise was not conceived by a local merchant, but rather by a group of ambitious American entrepreneurs. Their strategy was remarkably straightforward. They wanted to replicate the wildly successful model of Woolworths, which had already taken the nation by storm. The original pricing model at British Home Stores was strict and heavily promoted. Nothing on the shop floor would cost more than a single shilling. Not in its earliest days, the shop was a treasure trove of affordable necessities. Working-class mothers would queue at the tills to purchase haberdashery, basic kitchenware, and simple textiles. It was an era where value was paramount, and BHS delivered precisely what a financially strained public required. The counters were packed, the aisles were busy, and the concept quickly proved viable. However, breaking into a high street already dominated by established retail titans was no small feat. Woolworths possessed an absolute monopoly on the cheap variety market with its famous 3-penny and 6-penny model, while Marks & Spencer was steadily cementing its formidable reputation for reliable, British-made quality. From the very beginning, BHS was forced to carve out a precarious middle ground. The true defining era for BHS, and the period that would cement its status as a national institution, arrived in the wake of the Second World War. As Britain slowly emerged from the grim, grey shadows of rationing, bomb-damaged town centres, and post-war austerity, a vibrant new consumer society was born. The 1950s and 1960s heralded a golden age for the British high street. People finally had disposable income, and shopping transitioned from a chore of survival into a beloved leisure activity. BHS strategically positioned itself right at the epicenter of this retail revolution. The company expanded aggressively, shifting away from its restrictive nothing over a shilling rule. They began to open larger, purpose-built department stores in prime locations across the country. These new shops were marvels of mid-century retail design, featuring vast glass windows, modern fluorescent lighting, and wide aisles designed to accommodate the growing numbers of middle and working-class families. To compete directly with Marks & Spencer's famous St. Michael brand, BHS introduced its own in-house label, Prova, which offered affordable but fashionable clothing, homeware and food. For the post-war British housewife, a trip to BHS became a modern convenience. It offered a significant step up from the pure bargain bin nature of the early discount shops, yet it carefully avoided the intimidating, hushed reverence and high prices of traditional luxury department stores like Harrods or Selfridges. It was democratic retail, accessible, brightly lit, and thoroughly reliable. Yet, an underlying tension always hummed beneath the surface of this mid-century success. BHS was perpetually fighting a silent war on two fronts. Industry analysts and shoppers alike constantly compared it to M&S for clothing and to Woolworths for everyday variety. To survive and thrive in the long term, British home stores needed to become more than just a cheaper alternative to one or a slightly posher alternative to the other. It needed to forge a distinct cultural identity of its own. As the swinging 60s transformed British society, BHS was quietly laying the groundwork for its most prosperous era. The foundations were rock solid, the network of massive high street shops was established, and the brand was preparing to step entirely out of the shadows of its rivals. The golden era of the shopping centre was calling, and BHS was about to become the undisputed heartbeat of the British weekend. By the time the 1970s rolled into the neon-lit 1980s, the British High Street was undergoing a spectacular transformation. The era of the grand indoor shopping centre had arrived, and British Home Stores was invariably its anchor tenant. From the sprawling Arndale in Manchester to the busy corridors of the Bullring in Birmingham, no major retail development was considered complete without the familiar, bold BHS logo glowing prominently above its expansive glass entrances. Saturday mornings became a ritualistic pilgrimage for millions of families, and BHS sat right at the centre of this weekly tradition. To grow up in Britain during this era was to be intimately familiar with the sprawling aisles of BHS. In late August, the shops transformed into chaotic battlegrounds of parents and children frantically ticking off back-to-school lists. BHS was the undisputed champion of the British school uniform. It was the place where you stood on the grey, speckled carpet, awkwardly trying on stiff blazers, pleated skirts, and scratchy trousers, while queues at the tills snaked all the way back through the menswear section. Alongside the autumn rush, Christmas at BHS was a formidable, highly anticipated operation. By November, the stores became cavernous wonderlands of tinselled trees, brightly packaged toiletry gift sets, and the ubiquitous, heavy scent of festive potpourri. Millions of British homes were decorated with BHS baubles, their presents wrapped in BHS paper. The brand had successfully woven itself into the fabric of domestic British life. But if there was one department where BHS reigned absolutely supreme, it was lighting. Walk up the escalators of any multi-story BHS branch, and you would be greeted by a dazzling, blinding canopy of chandeliers, modern lampshades, and elaborate fixtures. It was a well-known industry truth that while Marks and Spencer dressed the nation, BHS illuminated it. Their lighting department was widely considered the best on the high street, innovative, aspirational, yet affordable, and incredibly popular, with a new generation of homeowners looking to modernize their living rooms. Beyond the merchandise, BHS offered a sanctuary from the busy pavements outside. The in-store cafe was a cultural institution in its own right. With its practical seating, trays of battered fish and chips, and endless pots of strong builder's tea, the BHS Cafe was a vital meeting place. Pensioners gathered on Tuesday mornings to escape the cold. Tired mothers fed their toddlers jam roly-poly on Saturday afternoons, and the staff behind the counters often knew their regular customers by name. It was the social glue of the provincial town centre, providing a safe, warm, and familiar environment. During the late 1980s, the company formally rebranded simply as BHS and merged with Mothercare to form the formidable Storehouse plc. At its zenith, the BHS empire boasted over 160 colossal stores, employing tens of thousands of loyal workers who proudly wore their lanyards and name badges. The business was generating massive revenues, firmly securing its position as a retail titan. It was a golden age of predictability, comfort, and dominance. So yet, as the 1990s progressed and the UK economy weathered a bitter recession, a subtle fatigue began to set in across the empire. The retail landscape was slowly accelerating, but BHS was a massive, lumbering beast. Its sprawling, multi-floor premises required astronomical upkeep. Consumer tastes were fracturing. High street fashion was becoming faster, and homeware was becoming sleeker. The trusty BHS model, offering a little bit of absolutely everything under one enormous roof, was quietly becoming clunky and incredibly expensive to run. The grey carpets were starting to fray at the edges, and the bright lights of the flagship stores were beginning to lose their sparkle. By the turn of the millennium, the Storehouse Group was struggling to revitalize an aging brand that felt increasingly out of step with the modern, cool Britannia era. BHS was vulnerable, its share price was flagging, and its massive property portfolio was looking dangerously exposed. It was precisely the kind of wounded corporate beast that attracts predators. And in the spring of 2000, a flamboyant billionaire from the aggressive world of private retail saw an opportunity that would alter the destiny of the beloved British chain forever. In May 2000, the British retail landscape experienced a seismic shift. British home stores, struggling to define its modern identity and deeply undervalued by the market, was snapped up for £200 million by the flamboyant billionaire Sir Philip Green. Green was a formidable, larger-than-life figure in the retail sector, known for his aggressive business tactics, his sharp financial acumen, and a lifestyle that saw him ruling his corporate empire from a luxury superyacht moored in Monaco. To the financial press and city analysts, the acquisition looked like a masterstroke. BHS had the prime high street property, the historical heritage, and the reliable footfall. It simply needed a ruthless operator to trim the fat and revitalize the balance sheet. At first, the takeover appeared to be an absolute triumph. Green immediately set to work dismantling the bloated corporate structure of the former Storehouse Group. He squeezed suppliers for better margins, aggressively renegotiated property leases, and ruthlessly cut administrative overheads. Within a remarkably short period, he engineered a stunning turnaround. BHS swung back into the black and profits soared. Green was briefly hailed as the undisputed savior of the British high street, a man who seemingly possessed the golden touch. However, while the cash tills were ringing, the financial engineering operating behind the scenes was laying the invisible groundwork for future catastrophe. The impressive profits generated by the hard-working shop staff and the incredibly loyal customer base were not being heavily reinvested back into the physical estate. Instead, immense sums were being systematically extracted from the business. In the early years of his reign, massive dividends were paid out to Green's family, most notably contributing to a record-breaking £1.2 billion dividend across his entire retail empire in 2005, legally channeled offshore. The BH's cash cow was being milked dry, leaving the underlying business starved of the crucial capital required to evolve. The dynamic shifted permanently and fatally in 2002 when Green acquired the Arcadia Group, a retail behemoth that included high street heavyweights like Burton, Dorothy Perkins, Wallace, Miss Selfridge, and the undisputed jewel in the crown, Topshop. Suddenly, BHS was no longer the sole focus of Green's empire. It was unceremoniously absorbed into a sprawling, complex retail conglomerate. Almost overnight, the historic department store became the neglected stepchild of the Arcadia family. The contrast in corporate treatment was stark and undeniable. Millions of pounds were enthusiastically poured into transforming Topshop's Oxford Circus flagship into a glittering, celebrity-endorsed mecca of fast fashion. It became the epicenter of British youth culture, drawing massive crowds and international acclaim. Meanwhile, BHS was left to languish in the background. The capital expenditure required to maintain massive, multi-floor department stores in regional town centres was simply deemed too high, and the financial returns too low. For the everyday shopper walking the provincial high street, this corporate neglect manifested as a slow, painful, and highly visible physical decay. Walking into a BHS branch in the mid to late 2000s felt increasingly like stepping into a forgotten time warp. The vibrant, bustling energy of the 1980s had completely evaporated, replaced by a profound sense of institutional sadness. The vast shop floors, once a shining beacon of modern retail, now felt cavernous, cluttered, and bleak. The lighting department, once the undisputed pride of the company and the envy of competitors, seemed dim, dusty, and uninspired. Customers began to notice the frayed edges of the grey, speckled carpets, the scuffed paintwork on the walls, and the tired, outdated display fixtures. The clothing lines, hanging limply on crowded racks, felt drab and thoroughly disconnected from the rapidly changing trends that shoppers now expected. Even the beloved in-store cafes began to feel like relics of a bygone era, serving the same lukewarm tea and basic pastries on chipped trays in an environment that desperately cried out for a modern refurbishment. Behind the tills, the fiercely loyal staff, many of whom had dedicated decades of their working lives to the company, waged a daily, losing battle to keep the shops looking presentable. They ironed the clothes, polished the glass, and smiled at the regulars, but they were fighting a war without ammunition. They could not disguise the fact that corporate headquarters had essentially given up on them. The fundamental problem tearing at the heart of BHS was a catastrophic lack of investment. Retail is a brutal, unforgiving industry. If you stand still, you die. While rival high street chains were aggressively modernizing their store portfolios, experimenting with engaging visual merchandising, and building sleek, user-friendly e-commerce websites to capture the dawn of online shopping, BHS remained stubbornly anchored in the past. Sir Philip Green's business model was ultimately built on extracting maximum cash from legacy property and established brand loyalty, not on nurturing a modern, forward-facing retail brand. The core customer base was steadily aging, and there was absolutely no compelling reason for a younger generation to step through the massive glass doors. The once great titan of the British high street was being methodically hollowed out from the inside. By the end of the 2000s, as the global financial crisis began to bite and austerity measures loomed over the country, the cracks in the Arcadia empire were impossible to hide. BHS found itself dangerously exposed, carrying deep structural wounds into the most turbulent decade in retail history. As the calendar turned to 2010, the British retail landscape was unrecognizable from the golden era of the indoor shopping centre. A brutal and permanent revolution was sweeping across the high street, driven by the ruthless acceleration of fast fashion and the explosive, unstoppable rise of e-commerce. Consumer behavior had shifted dramatically in the wake of the 2008 financial crash, creating a highly polarized market. Shoppers were either hunting for absolute bargains at the bottom end or seeking premium, aspirational quality at the top. The middle ground, the traditional heartland where British home stores had comfortably resided for decades, was rapidly becoming a commercial graveyard. BHS found itself completely outflanked by a new generation of agile, aggressive competitors. On the budget front, Primark was rewriting the rules of British retail. With its massive, brightly lit shops and shockingly low prices, Primark captured the hearts of young shoppers and budget-conscious families alike. It offered up-to-the-minute trends at a fraction of the cost, making the sensible, traditional clothing lines at BHS look instantly obsolete and comparatively expensive. Simultaneously, the brand was being severely squeezed from above. Next had successfully transformed itself into a modern retail powerhouse, dominating the high street with its sharp tailoring, highly efficient catalogue operation, and incredibly sleek, contemporary homeware departments. Marks & Spencer, though facing its own corporate struggles, still retained an iron grip on quality and middle-class aspiration. Caught in this suffocating, squeezed middle, BHS suffered a catastrophic loss of identity. It was no longer cheap enough to compete with the aggressive discount chains, yet it completely lacked the premium feel, quality, or design edge required to tempt shoppers away from Next or M&S. The brand had become a retail purgatory. The core demographic that had loyally supported the shops through the 1980s and 1990s was naturally aging. The young mothers who once bought their children's school uniforms there were now grandmothers. And crucially, their children, now adults with their own families, were not returning to the shops of their youth. To the younger, digitally native generation, the BHS brand possessed zero cultural relevance. Walking past a BHS window display in a regional shopping centre invoked no excitement, no aspiration, and no desire to enter. The internet was fundamentally altering how Britain shopped, with online giants like Amazon and ASOS offering infinite choice and next-day delivery straight to the front door. While competitors invested heavily in slick apps, seamless e-commerce platforms, and sophisticated supply chains, BHS's digital presence felt like an afterthought. Clunky, difficult to navigate, and entirely disconnected from modern shopping habits. The company was trying to fight a highly sophisticated digital retail war using analog weapons. Inside the cavernous physical shops, the atmosphere grew increasingly desperate as footfall continued to plummet. The sheer scale of the BHS property portfolio, once the company's greatest asset, had mutated into a fatal liability. Running vast, multi-story department stores in prime town center locations incurred astronomical costs. Expensive, inflexible, long-term leases and steadily rising business rates became a crushing burden when the tills were no longer ringing. The expansive shop floors, designed to handle the massive weekend crowds of the 1990s, now felt hauntingly empty. The silence on the escalators was deafening. In a frantic attempt to arrest the decline and inject some much-needed youth appeal into the ailing brand, the Arcadia Group initiated a series of confusing, half-hearted strategic revamps. The management decided to parachute concessions of other Arcadia brands, such as Topshop, Dorothy Perkins, Evans and Wallace, into the vast, empty spaces of the BHS stores. The logic was that younger shoppers, drawn in by Topshop, might suddenly rediscover the wider BHS offering. Instead, the strategy created a jarring, uncomfortable visual disconnect. Placing a rack of loud, neon Topshop festival wear next to a tired BHS lighting display and racks of sensible, elasticated trousers did not modernize the shop. It only highlighted the profound identity crisis at the heart of the business. It felt less like a cohesive department store and more like a chaotic jumble sale of mismatched brands. Furthermore, placing these concessions inside a BHS branch did not elevate BHS. It simply diluted the appeal of the cooler Arcadia brands. The experiment failed to generate the necessary footfall to save the larger operation. The loyal staff, many of whom had served the company for 20 or 30 years, watched the slow deterioration of their beloved shops with growing dismay. They were forced to manage an impossible situation, dealing with broken fixtures, outdated point-of-sale technology, and plummeting staff morale, all while corporate headquarters seemed entirely bereft of a viable, long-term plan. They dutifully rearranged the declining stock and served the dwindling number of elderly regulars in the increasingly quiet cafes. But the writing was clearly on the wall. By 2014, the financial reality of this prolonged neglect was stark and undeniable. BHS was hemorrhaging cash at an alarming rate, losing tens of millions of pounds a year. The business had become a massive, bleeding wound on the balance sheet of the Arcadia Group. Sir Philip Green's empire, once defined by its Midas touch, was now saddled with a deeply unprofitable, rapidly decaying high street dinosaur. The strategy of extracting cash without reinvestment had finally reached its logical, devastating conclusion. BHS could no longer be saved by simply tweaking the window displays or rearranging the shop floor. The financial burden was too great, the brand fatigue too deep, and the market had moved on too far. Behind closed doors, the corporate hierarchy realized that turning the business around was a nearly impossible task. The multi-million-pound losses could not be sustained. The board needed an exit strategy, and the stage was being quietly set for a transaction that would shock the British public and seal the ultimate fate of an 88-year-old institution. By the spring of 2015, the financial reality of British home stores could no longer be disguised by aggressive accounting or empty corporate optimism. The company was hemorrhaging cash, effectively acting as a massive, heavy anchor dragging on the wider Arcadia Group. Sir Philip Green, the retail tycoon who had once been celebrated as the undisputed king of the British high street, now found himself burdened with a deeply unprofitable, rapidly decaying dinosaur. The enormous property portfolio, locked into expensive long-term leases in declining town centres, had transformed from a glittering asset into a toxic liability. Green needed an exit strategy, and he needed it urgently. On the 12th of March, 2015, an announcement sent shockwaves through the City of London and dominated the front pages of the national press. After 15 years of ownership, Sir Philip Green had officially sold BHS. However, it was not the sale itself that caused the collective gasp across the retail industry. It was the price tag. An 88-year-old British institution encompassing 164 massive department stores, a vast logistical supply chain, and a dedicated workforce of 11,000 people had been sold for a single, solitary £1 coin. In the ruthless world of corporate finance, a £1 transaction is not a bargain. It is a profound declaration of worthlessness. It is a legal mechanism used to offload a company that is considered so burdened by structural debt, failing infrastructure, and hidden liabilities that it possesses negative equity. To the financial analysts in their glass towers, the £1 sale was a cynical, desperate maneuver to amputate a gangrenous limb from the Arcadia empire. But to the loyal staff serving customers on the shop floors from Glasgow to Southampton, that single pound coin felt like a devastating, deeply personal insult. It was a cold, hard symbol that their decades of loyal labor, their early morning shifts, and their unwavering dedication to a beloved brand had ultimately amounted to nothing. The public shock deepened considerably when the identity of the buyer was revealed. The £1 coin had been handed over by a little-known consortium called Retail Acquisitions Limited. At the helm of this group was a man named Dominic Chappell. The business press immediately began scrutinizing Chappell's credentials, assuming he must be a seasoned retail turnaround specialist, an expert in high street logistics, or a financial heavyweight with deep pockets. He was none of these things. Dominic Chappell was a former racing driver with a colorful, highly controversial past. Crucially, he had absolutely zero experience in the retail sector. He had never run a high street shop, he had no background in negotiating with clothing suppliers, and he possessed no track record of managing a multi-million-pound corporate workforce. Even more alarming was his financial history. Chappell had previously been declared bankrupt on 2 separate occasions. The sheer audacity of the transaction left industry observers entirely bewildered. How could one of Britain's wealthiest billionaires, a man who intimately understood the unforgiving, brutal nature of the high street, hand the keys of a national treasure over to a twice-bankrupt former racing driver with no retail experience whatsoever? Green fiercely defended the transaction in the press, claiming that Retail Acquisitions had presented a credible, forward-looking business plan and that he had left the company in a secure position by writing off millions in internal debts. Chappell, meanwhile, stepped enthusiastically into the limelight. He toured the flagship shops, confidently promising a bright new dawn for BHS, speaking grandly of modernizing the cafes, revitalizing the clothing lines, and bringing the tired department stores back to their former glory. He presented himself as the enthusiastic savior the brand had been waiting for. However, behind the confident bravado and the neatly tailored suits, a profound sense of anxiety gripped the 11,000 members of staff. In the cramped staff break rooms at the back of the shops, beneath the hum of fluorescent lights, the mood was one of quiet terror. The people who worked the tills and restocked the fading lighting departments understood the reality of the business far better than the men in the boardrooms. They knew the carpets were still fraying, the roof was still leaking, and the customers were still walking past their doors and heading straight to Primark or Next. They instinctively understood that handing an ailing, deeply complex retail beast to an unproven consortium was not a rescue mission. It was a gamble of epic, dangerous proportions. The £1 sale was not a new beginning for BHS. It was the signing of its death warrant. The transaction effectively severed the brand from the protective, wealthy umbrella of the Arcadia Group, leaving it entirely exposed to the harsh elements of a modern retail market it could no longer navigate. But the most devastating element of the deal was yet to fully emerge into the public consciousness. Beneath the crumbling physical stores and the plummeting sales figures lay a massive, ticking financial time bomb, a hidden liability that would soon transform a tragic business failure into a full-blown national scandal. The handover of British home stores to Dominic Chappell's Retail Acquisitions Consortium was billed as a fresh start, a necessary disruption to save a failing brand. However, for those working on the shop floors and managing the rapidly decaying properties, the promised retail revolution never materialized. Instead of a strategic revival, the period following the infamous £1 sale quickly descended into an era of alarming financial extraction. The fundamental problem with acquiring a deeply unprofitable business with no retail experience was that Chappell and his team had no viable strategy for actually selling jumpers, teapots, or lighting fixtures to the British public. The physical shops desperately needed millions of pounds in capital investment to modernize, to repair leaking roofs, to replace the frayed, dangerous carpets, and to upgrade an archaic IT system that frequently crashed at the tills. But that vital cash injection never arrived. Instead of money flowing into the business, millions of pounds began to flow out. The new ownership structure orchestrated a series of complex financial maneuvers that effectively stripped the remaining assets from the dying company. Substantial sums were paid out to retail acquisitions in the form of management fees, professional services, and consultancy charges. The highly valuable lease for the BHS flagship store on London's Oxford Street was hastily sold off to raise quick capital, yet the proceeds were not used to replenish the shrinking stock levels or fix the crumbling regional branches. For the 11,000 staff members, the reality of this corporate asset stripping was a daily, visceral humiliation. They were the ones facing the confused and frustrated customers. As the company's cash reserves dwindled, suppliers became increasingly nervous about BHS's ability to pay its bills. Slowly but surely, the flow of new merchandise began to dry up. Deliveries became sporadic. The massive shop floors, once bursting with clothing and homeware, began to look hauntingly sparse. Staff were instructed to creatively spread out the remaining stock, spacing out racks of sensible trousers and arranging solitary table lamps to try and mask the gaping holes in the inventory. The contrast between the board of directors and the workers on the ground was stark and deeply unjust. While the new owners extracted fees and engaged in complex property deals, the dedicated shop assistants, many earning minimum wage, were reportedly buying their own cleaning supplies to keep the staff toilets presentable. They were fiercely protective of the brand they had served for decades, but they were effectively acting as the palliative carers for a terminally ill high street giant. They were fighting a desperate rearguard action, unaware that an even darker financial storm was gathering directly above their heads. As the physical shops slowly starved, the true, catastrophic legacy of the BHS collapse began to dominate the national headlines. Beneath the plummeting sales figures and the empty shelves lay a terrifying financial abyss: the BHS pension fund. For decades, thousands of BHS employees had diligently paid a portion of their modest wages into the company's final salary pension scheme. It was a solemn promise, a deferred wage that guaranteed them a measure of dignity and financial security in their old age. However, by the time Sir Philip Green sold the business for £1, that pension fund was in a state of critical disrepair. It had amassed a staggering deficit of £571 million. The revelation of the pension black hole transformed the BHS crisis from a standard business failure into a profound moral scandal. How had a company, which had paid out hundreds of millions of pounds in tax-free dividends to its billionaire owners in the early 2000s, been allowed to leave its loyal workforce facing financial ruin? The 20,000 current and former members of the pension scheme were thrown into a state of absolute terror. Women who had spent 30 years standing behind the tills, missing family weekends to work the Saturday shifts, suddenly faced the very real prospect of losing significant portions of their retirement income. The £1 sale was no longer viewed as a quirky business anomaly. It was fiercely scrutinized as a mechanism to dump a massive liability. By offloading BHS to retail acquisitions, the Arcadia Group had effectively severed its legal responsibility for the £571 million deficit, leaving it in the hands of a consortium that lacked the financial muscle to plug the gap. By the early months of 2016, the desperation within BHS headquarters reached a fever pitch. The company was completely out of cash. The final, fatal blow was dealt when credit insurers, the vital financial institutions that protect suppliers in case a retailer goes bankrupt, refused to provide cover for BHS. This meant that clothing manufacturers and homeware suppliers flatly refused to send any more goods to the shops unless they were paid entirely upfront in cash. It was a demand that BHS, suffocating under debt and plummeting footfall, simply could not meet. Dominic Chappell scrambled frantically to secure emergency loans, desperately trying to remortgage the remaining properties and begging for a last-minute financial lifeline to keep the lights on. but the city had lost all faith. The brand was toxic, the high street was unforgiving, and the numbers no longer made sense. The burden of the £571 million pension deficit, combined with years of severe underinvestment and the lethal rise of online shopping, had finally broken the camel's back. The clock had run out. The frantic boardroom negotiations collapsed. After 88 years of trading, surviving a world war, multiple recessions, and shifting cultural tides, the heartbeat of the British home stores empire finally stopped. The company was about to surrender to the inevitable, triggering a catastrophic sequence of events that would leave a permanent scar on the British high street. The morning of Monday, the 25th of April, 2016, dawned cold and grey across the United Kingdom. For the 11,000 employees of British home stores, it was a day that would be permanently etched into their memories, not for what happened on the shop floor, but for the devastating news flashing across their television screens and mobile phones before their shifts had even begun. After weeks of desperate, frantic speculation and furious boardroom maneuvers, the inevitable had finally occurred. BHS formally collapsed into administration. In the vocabulary of British corporate law, entering administration is akin to being placed on life support. The existing management is immediately stripped of its power, and independent financial experts, in this case, the firm Duff & Phelps, are parachuted in to take total control of the company. Their legal mandate is brutal and straightforward. Assess the financial wreckage, try to find a buyer to rescue the business as a going concern, and if that fails, claw back whatever cash they can to pay off a mountain of furious creditors. When the doors of the 164 shops opened at 9 a.m. that Monday, a surreal, deeply uncomfortable atmosphere descended upon the high street. The shops were officially still trading. The tills were switched on, and the lights in the cafe were glowing, but the soul of the business had been entirely hollowed out. Behind the counters, staff members wearing their familiar BHS lanyards tried to maintain a professional, dignified front, scanning items and serving tea while their internal worlds collapsed. Many of them had dedicated 10, 20, or even 30 years of their lives to the company. BHS was not just a job. For many, it was a surrogate family, a community hub, and the only professional life they had ever known. Now they were effectively working in a corporate ghost town, entirely at the mercy of administrators who operated from glass offices miles away in London. The immediate reaction from the British public was a mixture of profound shock and deep nostalgia. For decades, the BHS brand had been as permanent a fixture of the British town centre as the local post office or the town hall. The thought of those massive, multi-floor units standing dark and empty in the middle of premier shopping centres like the Metro Centre in Gateshead or the St David's Centre in Cardiff was almost unfathomable. Yet sympathy did not translate into footfall. Customers, sensing the distinct smell of corporate death, largely stayed away, assuming the shops were already closed or stripped bare. The administrators embarked on a frantic, high-stakes race against the clock to find a buyer. They essentially put the entire 88-year-old empire in the shop window, desperately seeking a wealthy retail savior to step in and rescue the brand. Rumors swirled wildly in the financial press. Names of various retail tycoons and private equity firms were floated as potential white knights. Sports Direct founder Mike Ashley was briefly touted as a potential buyer, bringing a fleeting glimmer of hope to the devastated workforce. But the reality of the BHS balance sheet was simply too toxic for any sensible investor to touch. Buying BHS did not just mean acquiring 164 outdated, decaying shops tied to expensive, inflexible, long-term leases. It also meant inheriting the catastrophic £571 million pension deficit and a brand reputation that had been dragged through the mud by years of underinvestment and the scandalous £1 sale. Any potential buyer took one look at the numbers, looked at the brutal, rapidly modernizing retail landscape dominated by e-commerce and fast fashion, and quickly walked away. BHS was deemed utterly unsellable. For 5 agonizing weeks, the staff of BHS, existed in a state of suffocating limbo. They turned up for their shifts every single day, keeping the shops as tidy as possible with the dwindling, fragmented stock they had left. They fielded endless, repetitive questions from concerned elderly customers who had been drinking their morning tea in the in-store cafes for decades. They waited for a miracle that deep down they knew was never going to come. That tiny, lingering flame of hope was finally and brutally extinguished on the 2nd of June 2016. The administrators issued a cold, clinical press release that sent a final, fatal shockwave through the British retail industry. Despite their best efforts, no viable buyer had been found. The rescue mission had officially failed. BHS was moving out of administration and into liquidation. The business would be entirely wound down. All 164 shops would be permanently closed, and all 11,000 members of staff would be made redundant. It was the biggest, most catastrophic collapse on the British High Street since the demise of Woolworths in 2008. The transition from administration to liquidation is a terrifying psychological shift. Administration implies a fight for survival. Liquidation is the absolute acceptance of death. It is the corporate equivalent of calling the undertaker. The human impact of the June announcement was immediate and devastating. Across the country, store managers, many of whom were in tears themselves, had to gather their teams on the shop floor before opening time to deliver the fatal blow. People who had met their husbands and wives in the BHS stockrooms, women who had worked the weekend shifts to put their children through university, and school leavers who had just started their first proper jobs were told that their livelihoods were gone. They were not just losing their incomes, they were losing their daily routines, their colleagues, and a massive part of their identity. The anxiety was compounded by the terrifying uncertainty surrounding their pensions, leaving thousands of older workers facing a sudden, frightening poverty in their retirement. Almost immediately, the nature of the shops changed. The quiet dignity the staff had tried to maintain was shattered as the liquidators moved in to strip the carcass. The objective was no longer to run a department store. It was to liquidate every single physical asset to generate cash for the creditors. Massive, lurid yellow and black, closing down, everything must go signs were plastered aggressively across the shop fronts, entirely obscuring the familiar, trusted BHS logos. The carefully arranged window displays were ripped out. The shops were flooded with bargain hunters, drawn not by brand loyalty, but by the morbid thrill of a corporate fire sale. The dignified British home stores had been unceremoniously reduced to a chaotic, depressing jumble sale. The shelves, once neatly stocked with school uniforms and expensive lighting fixtures, became chaotic battlegrounds of heavily discounted, mismatched stock. The air of the stores shifted from institutional sadness to a chaotic, undignified scramble. For the staff behind the tills, forced to facilitate the very sale that was destroying their jobs, the final weeks of trading would demand an unimaginable level of emotional resilience. The death rattle of the BHS empire had begun, and the final curtain was preparing to fall on the British High Street. August 2016 was a cruel, unforgiving month on the British High Street. The slow, painful demise of British home stores had culminated in a highly public, profoundly undignified retail execution. Across the country, the final weeks of trading transformed the once proud department stores into chaotic, depressing scavenger hunts. The dignified, familiar window displays that had once showcased immaculate school uniforms and glowing Christmas scenes were now completely obliterated by massive, lurid yellow and red posters screaming, "Closing down! Everything must go!" and final reductions. Inside the shops, the atmosphere was chaotic and deeply unsettling. The liquidation process was completely devoid of sentimentality. Its sole objective was to extract every last available penny from the decaying carcass of the empire to pay off a mountain of corporate debt. As the weeks progressed, the discounts grew steeper, 20%, then 50%, then a desperate 80% off. This dramatic slashing of prices attracted a very different type of footfall. The loyal, elderly regulars who had treated the shop as a community hub were replaced by aggressive bargain hunters drawn by the morbid, frenzied thrill of a corporate fire sale. The vast shop floors, once meticulously arranged, quickly descended into absolute disarray. Clothing was pulled from hangers and left in tangled heaps on the fraying grey carpets. The homeware department was stripped bare, leaving only a scattering of odd plates, chipped mugs, and lonely bath mats. The lighting department, once the undisputed, dazzling crown jewel of the BHS empire, was reduced to a sad collection of tangled wires, heavily discounted bulbs, and half-empty display boards. The physical decay of the shops, which had been slowly advancing for years, was now completely exposed. Without the neatly arranged merchandise to distract the eye, the scuffed paintwork, the water-stained ceiling tiles, and the archaic point-of-sale systems became glaringly obvious. But the true indignity of the liquidation went far beyond the sale of discounted cardigans and teapots. When the liquidators said, "Everything must go," they meant it literally. The very infrastructure of the business was priced up for disposal. Customers were not just buying the stock, they were buying the metal shelving units, the wooden display tables, and the coat hangers. In a particularly dystopian visual, the shop's plastic mannequins were stripped naked, dismantled, and piled up near the escalators with handwritten price tags slapped across their plastic torsos. Down in the beloved in-store cafes, the commercial ovens, the tea urns, and the very chairs where generations of British families had shared their Saturday lunches were aggressively hawked to local restaurant owners. For the shop staff, these final weeks required an almost superhuman level of emotional resilience. They were effectively being forced to dismantle their own professional homes. They had to stand behind the tills, wearing their familiar BHS uniforms and name badges, processing the transactions of customers who were cheerfully haggling over pennies, all while the staff themselves were staring directly into the abyss of unemployment. Many of them had to endure the heartbreaking task of serving their regular, long-time customers one last time, sharing tearful goodbyes across the till points. They maintained a fierce, unwavering professionalism right to the bitter end, protecting the dignity of the BHS name long after the boardroom executives had completely abandoned it. The 164 shops were not closed all at once. The estate was brutally wound down in scheduled tranches throughout July and August. Each week, another batch of high street locations went permanently dark. Their staff handed their P45s and shown the door. By the final week of August 2016, only a tiny handful of shops remained open, operating as the last, fading outposts of a fallen empire. Sunday, the 28th of August 2016, marked the absolute end. It was the final day of trading for the last remaining British home stores. By this point, there was virtually nothing left to sell. The vast, multi-story premises were cavernous, echoing voids. The tills had been emptied, the shelves were entirely bare, and the escalators had been switched off to save electricity. The dust motes danced in the harsh glare of the remaining fluorescent lights, highlighting the sheer, terrifying scale of the empty retail space. The silence inside the shops was profound and heavy, a stark, painful contrast to the bustling, noisy Saturday mornings of the 1980s and 1990s. As the afternoon wore on, the final few bargain hunters were politely ushered out into the late summer air. Inside, the remaining members of staff gathered together near the front entrances. In branches across the country, from the suburbs of London to the town centres of the north, impromptu, tearful farewells took place. Colleagues who had worked side by side for decades, sharing life milestones, marriages, and family tragedies in the staff break rooms, hugged each other tightly. Many signed each other's lanyards and uniform shirts, treating them as poignant souvenirs of a lost era. They took final, heartbreaking group photographs against the backdrop of the empty, desolate shop floors. At precisely 4 p.m., the moment of absolute finality arrived. The store managers, clutching heavy bunches of keys, walked to the main entrances. With trembling hands and tear-filled eyes, they pulled the heavy glass doors shut. The locks clicked into place from the inside. A moment later, the loud, definitive metallic rattle of the exterior security shutters echoed across the pavements as they were rolled down for the very last time. The physical death of BHS was complete. The immediate aftermath on the British High Street was deeply unsettling. The sheer size of the BHS shops meant their sudden closure left massive, gaping black holes in the center of the nation's premier shopping districts. These were not small, easily replaceable boutique units. These were massive, multi-floor anchor stores. Almost overnight, vibrant shopping centers felt suddenly desolate, as if a vital organ had been abruptly surgically removed. Passers-by would instinctively look towards the familiar entrances, only to be met with the cold, unforgiving sight of pulled steel shutters and fading, peeling window decals. The 11,000 members of staff walked away from the locked doors and out into an incredibly uncertain future, victims of a corporate disaster they had absolutely no hand in creating. The lights of the BHS empire, which had illuminated the British High Street for 88 years, were finally, permanently extinguished. But the story of the brand was not quite over. The catastrophic fallout from its collapse was about to trigger a fierce national reckoning. The dust had barely settled on the locked doors of the 164 shops before a fierce, unprecedented storm broke within the halls of Westminster. The collapse of British home stores was not merely recorded as a tragic casualty of the changing high street. It was aggressively pursued as a national scandal of corporate greed and catastrophic mismanagement. The £571 million pension black hole could not be ignored, and the British Parliament demanded immediate answers. In the months that followed the liquidation, the nation watched in disbelief as the architects of the BHS demise were dragged before highly publicised, televised parliamentary select committees. Sir Philip Green, once lauded as a retail genius and a titan of the high street, faced a brutal, humiliating interrogation from MPs regarding the immense, tax-free dividends his family had extracted from the company while the pension fund withered. Dominic Chappell, the former racing driver who had bought the empire for £1, was similarly eviscerated for his chaotic tenure during the disastrous final year. The public outrage was palpable, focused intensely on the profound injustice faced by the 11,000 redundant workers and the 20,000 pension members facing a terrifyingly uncertain retirement. Under immense political and public pressure, including unprecedented furious calls for him to be officially stripped of his knighthood, Sir Philip Green eventually agreed to write a personal cheque for £363 million to rescue the BHS pension scheme. It provided a crucial financial lifeline to the former staff, but it could not erase the profound anxiety, job losses, and trauma of the preceding year. Chappell, meanwhile, faced his own severe legal reckoning, eventually receiving a prison sentence for tax evasion related to his time at the company. Yet, strictly speaking, the BHS name did not completely vanish from the earth. In the chaotic aftermath of the liquidation, the international franchise and online rights were quietly purchased by the Qatari-based Arcadia Group. The brand was later relaunched purely as an e-commerce website, selling homeware, lighting, and clothing to a digital audience. However, to the British public, this online revival was nothing more than a hollow digital ghost. You cannot replicate the soul of a high street institution on a glowing smartphone screen. A website cannot offer a warm cafe on a rainy Tuesday morning, nor can it replicate the chaotic, shared cultural experience of trying on school uniforms in late August. The web address might have survived, but the beating heart of British home stores was definitively dead. The true, lasting legacy of the collapse was etched physically into the architectural landscape of the United Kingdom. For years after the final shutters were pulled down, those massive, multi-story BHS units stood completely empty, haunting town centres and shopping centres from Aberdeen to Plymouth. They were simply too vast, too archaic, and too expensive for modern retailers to easily fill. The fading silhouettes of the BHS lettering on the brickwork became grim monuments to a bygone era of retail dominance. Eventually, some of the spaces were carved up and repurposed into budget gyms, indoor markets, or expansive Primark stores, while others lay stubbornly derelict for the better part of a decade. Ultimately, the tragedy of BHS serves as the ultimate cautionary tale of modern British corporate history. It is a stark, unforgiving reminder that legacy, affection, and nostalgia are not protective shields against the ruthless mechanics of the modern economy. A brand can be deeply woven into the cultural fabric of a nation, holding the cherished Saturday memories of millions of families, and still be utterly destroyed by a toxic combination of financial extraction and a fatal refusal to adapt. The shops are gone. The till receipts have faded, but the painful lessons of its fall remain permanently imprinted on the British High Street. The collapse of British home stores was not a simple tale of a business failing to sell enough jumpers or teapots. It was a profound, multi-layered tragedy that exposed the darkest, most unforgiving corners of modern corporate engineering. But beyond the scandalous £1 sale, the devastating pension deficit, and the parliamentary inquiries, the death of BHS represents something far more personal to the British public. For 88 years, this was a brand intricately woven into the very fabric of the nation. Retail, at its core, is never merely a series of financial transactions. It is a shared, cultural experience. It is the distinct memory of a busy Saturday morning queue, the familiar clatter of the in-store cafe, the annual autumn ritual of buying a stiff new school uniform, and the quiet pride of purchasing the perfect lighting fixture for a new family home. When a massive multi-floor department store like BHS is abruptly hollowed out, locked, and stripped bare, it is not just a commercial unit that is lost. A vital piece of the town's civic architecture, a place of routine, comfort, and belonging, vanishes completely. History continually proves that no retail empire, regardless of its monumental size or its glorious past, is ever truly safe. Businesses survive only through relentless, forward-looking adaptation, but they die the moment they believe their history will shield them from the future. The vast, empty shopfronts and fading BHS logos that scarred the high streets for years after the collapse stand as a stark, permanent reminder of that brutal truth. The British High Street has changed forever, and the familiar names we once took for granted are slowly, quietly slipping away. What are your memories of British home stores? Did you spend decades working behind the tills, or do you simply remember those weekend shopping trips and the Christmas displays? Please share your stories and memories in the comments below. If you want to explore more histories of Britain's lost retail titans and the changing face of our shopping centres, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching.